As a feminist philosopher, what I found very exciting lately is the fact that intersectional analysis seems to me to become really a consensus among most people. But so I'd say my source of optimism is to say feminist philosophers, most of them today, are convinced by the importance of intersectional analysis, and I feel like there's an interest in trying to revisit what has been called second wave feminism through the lens of all the failures of second wave feminism that have been manifested by the third wave, and so mostly by Black and Indigenous women. And I found this to be very exciting. At the same time, as a French person and as a person living on an American campus, I am very worried by what looks like a sort of fragmentation of a certain left. In France, it's very striking how first what they've called Islamo-leftism has created a big drift in France with this idea that intersectional intellectuals, like a lot of French people of color, but also academics like me, were accused of being pro-Islamism out of being anti the French French imperialism, let's say. And now there is this whole moral panic about wokeism, and I'm very worried of what it creates.
So in that sense, I'm sometimes quite surprised that we have this media war going on, and you feel like, okay, this is like the main battlefield right now. And I think what Manon said at the end, this is also something which I'm also fearing, that the whole political the political landscape will be totally different after this war has been probably fought. But at the same time, and I think that has to be taken into consideration. At the same time, we still have like organizations, probably like, for example, unions, who are where these kind of I don't know how this kind of debates are being fought all the time, and they are probably kind of a lab. On my understanding, they could be a kind of a lab for to deal with these issues in a different way, and not as contradictions between different positions, but rather working in the same directions from a common ground. And the common ground, I think, is the social question for us. And in the social question, there are definitely many things are playing into this field. So I think it's always a question of how you deal with the issues, how big you make these kind of cancel culture, wokeism type of thing. I think 98% of the Germans still don't know what the term woke actually means, but everyone is talking about it in the media. Even like the politicians are now are using it, like right-wing politicians, like from probably the Conservative Party, and sometimes I'm more like kind of, we should relax on certain issues probably, if it's still possible. Probably it's a different situation to the one in the US, but we shouldn't like kind of make it bigger in a sense, but rather try to keep in mind that this intersectional approach has already won in many regards, and now we have to keep on from this and work on it and put it on a broader basis. Also talk about probably new issues who are coming up, which are old issues basically, but now is probably the time to speak about it.
Other actors have been quite successful to frame fights against oppression as an elitist project. And I'm not sure whether or not this is just a media phenomenon. I would agree with Romin that there are many circles in the country where these discussions don't hit the ground. But I think the idea that fights against discrimination are like hobbies or of privileged academic people who have to decide to discuss a little bit about racism and sexism, this is very dominant, and I think that's a problem. And from my opinion, left-wing or progressive movement have not been very good at answering that, at deconstructing this reproach that this politic is a politics of privileged people. So I think that would be very important to discuss. Why is this framing so influential against all evidence, and even influential in parts of the academic debate? I think there is one weakness within progressive or leftist movements and within progressive academic debates, and that is that we cannot deny that the answers on the social questions are answers within national states. Welfare states are organized within nation states. And so we have to discuss the social question with a transnational perspective. And I don't see here very lively or vibrant debates how we can reinvent the social question beyond welfare states, but not with deregulation and destruction of welfare states, but with an emancipatory perspective to further develop them in another perspective. And I have to be honest, I don't have an answer on that. We don't have a global dimension on, or global perspective on social rights. And I think if we don't find answers on that, we will have this cleavage between those who fear that they lose their rights within the privileged nation states of the global north, and those fighting against their suppression in other parts of the world.
You have this kind of articulation of the importance of non-reformist reforms across the left in the United States, and kind of the more classic, democratic socialists of America or socialist point of view. There's a borrowing from a framework or frameworks developed by, in a long line of Marxist and socialist kind of thinkers. Andre Gores tends to be the one who's cited most often in his work Strategy of Labor, where he articulates a non-reformist reform that strikes at the power of capital, that is a demand that's based not on the dictates of capital, but on the kind of the imagination and the possibility of fundamentally different political, economic, and social structures. And importantly, he emphasizes kind of the need of non-reformist reforms to come from and expand democratic power. So the power of the working class to kind of implement and demand self-determination of a sort. And then you kind of have this kind of parallel but intersecting prison abolitionist conception of non-reformist reforms, which is focused on reforms that don't legitimate but undermine and shrink the footprint, the legitimacy, and the resources at the disposal of the carceral state, so prisons and police. And of course, the mobilizations last summer against the police murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, where we saw kind of defund the police as being the primary, in a sense, the primary organic demand from the street, in a way that took many of us by surprise, even those of us who were studying left social movements and participating in them, is kind of a classic or now central example of a non-reformist reform, at least for those whose primary kind of radical horizon is rooted in prison abolition, which I should say, when you think about its origins, or its contemporary origins, of course, it's a long tradition in the writings and organizing of people like Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore. Itself is a kind of Marxist and socialist politic, just with kind of different kind of emphasis on the centrality of prisons and police as kind of the forefront of the struggle. And so I think the question, the structural account of repression, yes, it's rooted in all the things that you mentioned at the outset, Robin, in terms of structures of global capital, including, I would say, transnational finance, legal structures, and nation state. And in the US, the reform kind of question has become important for the left in new ways. And so you both have this emphasis on non-reformist reform, and then you have also these electoral campaigns in a way that are also relatively new that we didn't see for many decades in terms of course, classically Bernie Sanders' campaign for the presidency, but then also the so-called squad. So these more kind of left-wing, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez members of Congress, and then kind of cognates at the state and local level, people running out of the Democratic Socialists of America. So kind of a left electoral politic in a way, again, that we haven't seen in a long time. And on the one hand, I think this is all kind of like a great source of optimism. It has been for me. And on the other hand, I think many people think now, at least at the moment, we're arguably in a moment of demobilization on the left, and that some of this might be precisely that we've tilted too much toward electoralism and reformism and haven't spent enough time or haven't focused enough in the kinds of projects that Roman is articulating in terms of organizing, building organizations and kind of outside of the state institutional forms in a way that would make us less reactive and more kind of sustainable in building radical politics and building working class consciousness.
We can definitely say, demonstrate how sexism and racism are tools in order to appropriate unpaid or low-paid labor. I think that's one very important point to say that struggles against sexist and racist oppression have always a materialist dimension, have always been struggles against exploitation. Within many theoretical intersectionalist approaches, we have the problem that class is taken into account, but very often in terms of classism, of discrimination on the basis of class. But that's something completely different than a structuralist perspective on class as a basis of exploitation. And so we have to look twice whether or not class means that someone is discriminated for a certain class-related behavior, or if it really on the terms of economic exploitation. Is it a good idea to base social struggles on categories of identity who are the result of oppression and discrimination? And I also think that the perspectives of Stuart Hall, with his perspective of identity politics of first grade, people organize and cooperate on the basis of categories they are addressed in to fight back. And then his second perspective, and I think that's interesting to discuss, about an identity politics of a second grade. And this is a perspective to challenge or to override the categories and to look for a pluralist common.
But my experience was when we had the situations in broader conferences, conventions of the unions, when there was a situation that people took the stage and brought up their own perspective, then there was a certain situation of relief. But we are creating this kind of multicultural, multiracial, multi-identity space, which is also where people like queer people are taken into consideration, like lots of different identities. But this whole idea that we are actually following also in our organizations, that we are like anti-racist, democratic, open, I don't know, you name it, that a lot of people know that is that if we don't live it, then then these are just words. Especially for social organizations, it creates it's authentic, and this is also like it's a resource. It's empowering for everyone in a way when this kind of range of identities is being shown, not in a diversity or kind of shiny, glamorous way, but rather in a how you call it, in a way which is like basically which reflects the daily life of working class people, basically.
One of the contradictions, of course, is this need for mass politics, because one of the really important things that I think distinguishes left politics from other forms of politics is precisely that we believe in the multitude and the people and the many. And so how to kind of take all of these different things that divide us, whether discursively or practically, and that are mobilized by elites in a way that allows us to build the kind of mass politics that it would take to meet, overcome, overthrow capitalism, patriarchy, and white supremacy is, I think, in some sense, the key question. And of course, we can't figure that out overnight. But of course, we know that, like all of the kind of major struggles of our day that you both have been framing throughout, whether it's struggles against prisons and police, the need for housing, the need to slow down extractivism and exploitation of human and non-human life, these are the things that link us together and that allow us to kind of that allow us to kind of struggle through this question of how to build solidarity.
I think, there's no doubt for me that feminism would work better if men were part of it. But I think also anti-class oppression struggles would work better if the bosses were part of it. But the problem is that I'm not sure. I'm sure some men have really no interest in joining the feminist struggle because they have too much to lose. But I do think that there are ways to look at how fighting for a more just world is better for everyone. And it's not just a sort of Kantian feeling that you've done the right thing, but that I think since we're theoretically in Germany, I think, for instance, men would benefit, and some men do benefit, in having more gender egalitarian views because that gives them the joy of being parents. I think in Germany, the way a big spot of male privilege has been not taking care of kids, but taking care of kids is also something that can be very joyful when it's not something that prevents you from doing anything else that you might pursue. And then you have this question of how submission is at the core of American racism, like how Asian women are a victim of racism because they're seen as the perfect submissive women and this is enforced on them. But on the other hand, African American women are really victims of racism because they're seen as not submissive and as not playing the game of a certain idea of femininity. So all of this to say that even inside a sort of form of structural oppression, you have people who have privileges. Like French women are privileged compared to German women with regards to motherhood. German women are privileged compared to French women with regards to imperatives on their body and the availability of their body for the sexual conquest of men. But I think this is a good argument to take a step back from the privilege framework to think in term to put back a vocabulary of justice and political imperatives and even moral imperatives in the discourse, that in a way thinking in terms of privilege has a form of utilitarianism in the background at all times, that you should want things that will maximize your own utility. And I think maybe this is really what is the core belief that we all need to fight in the fights against all forms of oppression, is to say, is it really the case that we should want to be constantly as high as we can on the hierarchy so that we maximize our gains, we maximize our available time, we maximize our recognition, we maximize. So this, I think, this vocabulary of privilege can be used to highlight this obsession of maximization that we have, I feel, these days, and that might be at the core of our problems.
I would like to pick up the perspective on privileges, because I think we have to talk about that when we talk about the social divisions and struggles, because I think very often, I think, in left-wing movements, it's this idea all good things go together, and there might be struggles within the movements and contradictions. We see them with regard to the climate change and the social question, and it is a fact that people who are rather poor and economically not privileged in Germany are privileged in a global sense and do have a footprint which exceeds those of others and so on. So we always have to take into account that privilege might be relative without negating it in a certain context, and privileges are disputed. In certain contexts, some privileges might be more important than others. So I think we always, there is this notion of multitude or solidarity across all divisions, but we can only talk about what divisions can be crossed when we talk where are really disputes and contradictions and interests. I think it was a huge step within social movements against oppression to bring in this perspective, because it I think it sensitized for the structural dimension of oppression, that I don't have to be consciously and willingly racist or sexist in order to profit or benefit from the structural conditions of my existence. And I think that was a huge steps within movements to understand that racism and sexism and other forms of oppression have this structural dimension of privilege, even though I don't like the privilege. And I think that was really very important. But now, sometimes, I think the perspective on privilege is a little bit overstretched, because I think if we want to have broad mass movements against oppression, we do have to accept that even people who are privileged in some sense can be in solidarity with those oppressed. And I think that sometimes there is this tendency that it has to be a first-hand experience in order to be a true speaker person for this struggle or for this fight. And I think there might be historical conditions where this is the case. For example, when the Convergence River Collective, when they wrote their statements, their voice or this perspective was completely absent from the public debate. But I think now we are in another, it's decades since then, in some perspective, and that's good, and that's a success of social movements. I can read about them, I can hear them, even though it's not my own position. And I think we do, for progressive movements, the first-hand experience is important. I don't want to deny that, but we have to go a step further and to discuss about solidarity from a perspective who does not have the first-hand experience. And I think this perspective of solidarity should not disappear behind movements that are very, very strong on this first-hand experience as true basis of resistance.
If you embrace an intersectional framework, whether you're thinking about patriarchy and you think, the opposition is men, or in some sense, or you're focused on an anti-capitalist or some kind of integrated analysis, the question of who is the opposition and how do we relate to them? To what extent is reform or persuasion the tool to convince them that, join our fight because there's benefits for you too, versus taking on a more oppositional approach, I think are all strategic questions that, can kind of be meditated on through the lens of whether reform or revolution is the mode of response. But I think, but it seems important, and it seems like in some sense some fundamental distinction between liberal and left approaches to not be settled or complacent with the idea that it is in the domain of discourse and persuasion that we're going to win these struggles.